It's my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant General Mike Jeffery, our second keynote speaker. As you know, I've been keeping the introductions very brief because all of our speakers have long, distinguished biographies and they're all listed in the program. But I'm going to depart from that this time because I think if you don't know General Jeffery and you read his biography, it won't quite give you the picture of why it is that we're so pleased to have him here as a keynote speaker. So and before I go any further, I'd just like to point out that this is not calculated to enhance my promotion chances because quite frankly, it would take the intervention of a being considerably more supreme than a three-star general for that to happen. So I have no dog in this fight. General Jeffery, let's stipulate, was a great battery commander, regimental commander, commandant of the Staff College, commander of the division, or he wouldn't have gotten to be the Army commander. Okay, we'll stipulate that. When he took over command of the Army in a time which is we call the decade of darkness, where we had been through a long period of austerity, and I think you could fairly say our response to that was to keep our fingers crossed and whistle past the graveyard and hope for better times. And when he came in, this is amongst his accomplishments, the one that I remember as a junior guy at the time, is that he said, what we are doing is not sustainable. We're not in a position where we could generate forces if called on, and therefore we need to make some hard decisions. So he consulted, he talked to the senior leadership, and he came up with a series of changes, organizational changes, that were thought to be wildly radical by some and interfered with people's rights goals. And having identified that way ahead, that pragmatic way ahead, then had the leadership to cajole, influence, and ultimately tell the Army that this was the way we had to go. And I think it's also fair to say, and I could make this argument in more detail, that those changes were things that were of incredible importance in setting up the Army for the success we were to have as a fighting Army in Afghanistan. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Lieutenant General Mike Jeffery. Sir.
Thank you, Tony. I just hope I can live up to those expectations. It is a pleasure to be with you. Normally I would have spent the full conference with you, but unfortunately I literally just got back in country, having spent close to a month on holiday in Europe, which was really great. But in the closing days of that, I picked up a cold, so my apologies. I'm going to be a little raspy. I just hope my voice will hold up for the session. I've been asked to provide you a perspective on the profession of arms in the age of austerity, and in particular to address how military leaders should deal with civilian authorities in times of retrenchment. The subject is an enormous one, touching on public policy, military force development, defense resource management, and of course political relationships. Certainly there is far more to the topic than anyone can address in a short session we have together this afternoon. What I will try to do is reflect on the subject and provide you some food for thought, and hopefully that will provide you at least a foundation along with the other speakers that will allow us to get into Q&A and perhaps explore the more interesting areas in that forum. In covering the topic, I'm taking the perspective of a practitioner, not an academic. In addition to what Tony said, I'm going to lean heavily on my experiences as a senior staff officer at NDHQ through the period of a major budget reduction in the early to mid-1990s, and of course my time as Army commander. The two significant parts of that, I think, are in 94-95, given the federal government's budget reduction, which saw the defense budget being reduced by in excess of 40% in a very, very short period of time, we went through an exercise of re-evaluating and literally looking at re-engineering the whole business of defense. So there's a lot of expertise and experience in that regard. And not to put too fine a point on it, when I took over as Army commander, it was, I would argue, the lowest ebb of the Army's resource fortune in over 50 years. That's where we were. So, and I and many others who were serving at the time had a fair bit of experience trying to deal with that. In providing my views, I would not claim to have practiced all that I might preach today. The reality is I learned a lot going through that period, most of it through trial and error. And in many ways, my thoughts today are a result of a long-term reflection on what we did right and what we could have done better in a very, very difficult period. The topic of the profession of arms in the age of austerity is probably, in my view, the most germane one that the military profession and military forces in the Western world face today. All nations are encountering major economic challenges. Mounting debt, economic stagnation are reducing our ability to meet the nation's needs, and there's a real potential that things will get worse before they get better. I know that I'm probably repeating something that others have said yesterday, but I do need to make clear, I think we're in for a long-haul, difficult economic time. The possibility of the Eurozone breakup and a real potential for economic crisis to ripple across the globe for a prolonged period. And even if we avoid such impacts in the short term, I think it's virtually certain we're facing a long period of minimal growth. The good times are behind us, and the age of austerity will be with us for some time. And in my mind, barring a miracle, nothing short of 20 years before we start to see substantive change. I'm no economist, but as a practitioner and one who's looking at this, I just don't know how we could possibly solve the problem any earlier than that. And the implications for defense and security of the Western world, I think, are considerable. As Paul Kennedy implies in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, military power ultimately depends on economic power, a lesson I think that many nations have forgotten. In such an environment, nations must make some very hard decisions and may take some risks in a number of areas to maintain that economic power if they have any hope of maintaining their military power. While some may trumpet Canada's recent economic successes, we're far from immune from the disease. If we're to weather the coming storm, I think we need to get our fiscal house in order as a nation and invest in areas that address our long-term strategic interests. In short, even as I stand here as a soldier, anyone who believes that defense should somehow be protected from the economic diet that's going to face the nation is misguided. We're going to face it, and as many of our colleagues, UK is probably one of the ones going through the biggest cut right now. If you don't think it's going to happen here, I'm sorry, you're going to see more and more of that. I'm convinced of it. But I need to make the point that equally naive is the view that defense doesn't matter and that we can take our security for granted. And that's particularly unique to Canadians. The reality is the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and I think there's a real possibility that Canada will again be required to commit significant military force to ensure its security, either at home or abroad. I'll not attempt to make that case here in detail. I trust that speakers yesterday have already done that, but if you want to challenge me on it in the questions, happy to take you on. So, what's the question? General Stu Beers, what is the test question I'm being asked here? And I think it is, how then should defense officials address the defense and security needs of the nation during this period of austerity, and in particular, how should they work with all parts of government to realize that objective? It is my view that the military officials face two issues or tasks. The first is the matter of the business of defense of the nation. And I'm going to emphasize business of defense. I'm not talking operations and deployment. I'm talking about the building of capability and the maintenance of that capability. And that is the development of a strategy and a set of capabilities that will address the nation's defense needs. In this regards, we should not just think in terms of senior military officers making those decisions, but rather a defense team of military and civilian leaders, each bringing particular skills to the task. Making very clear, the senior military does not make all of the decisions that are critical. Our civilian colleagues within the department play an equally important and influential role in that. They are part of that team. The second issue facing those defense officials is convincing the government and ultimately the nation to commit the resources and effort to implement the strategy that's developed. In short, creating the national will to face the tough decisions and sacrifices required to ensure an adequate defense of the nation. Now, looking at those two tasks This is not a linear problem, but one that needs to be worked iteratively over time. So while defense officials may develop some options, it is ultimately the government that decides upon the strategy. And the relationship between defense officials and the other players in government during this process will be critical in shaping the outcome. And I want to get onto that in a few minutes in terms of some of those dynamics. So as I see it, the task of the defense officials is to develop a strategy for the nation's defense and to gain acceptance of it by government and the people, with its implicit commitment of national resources. That may sound like a straightforward matter, but there are many factors that impact on achieving that aim. Perhaps the biggest factor in advancing the defense agenda is the credibility of the Department of Defense, and in particular, the military and defense leadership. If the government has confidence in the organization and its leadership, they are more likely to make the tough choices in favor of defense. In my view, defense officials should therefore shape their decisions and actions heavily influenced by the requirement to maintain its institutional credibility. Now, that does not mean the decision should be determined only by what government will accept. Rather, it speaks to the necessity for discipline, objectivity, and coherence of approach in everything that's done. And developing such credibility will take time, for only with time will government bureaucrats and political leaders trust that the department is objective. And I'll come back to that issue of time several times in my comments. Now, here I should state that the premise of this topic, that certain approaches are required in an age of austerity, might itself be flawed. I would argue that defense should not follow different strategies just because times are tough. Rather, an approach or a philosophy that constantly strives for defense credibility should be the norm. It is, after all, only over the long term that real credibility of the institution and its leadership is achieved. It cannot be built in the short term. And to make the point, trying to establish the institution's credibility now, having squandered it during the good time, does not put you in a strong position for negotiation. Now, there are many other factors that I would highlight as key to gaining acceptance of a defense strategy. And they are all, in many respects, components of building that credibility. But they stand on their own, and I'm going to take some time and highlight them to establish the foundation of what I think is essential to give us the position to argue the case of defense. A critical element of that institutional credibility is the presence of a professional, strategic leadership within the Defense Department. The business of defense is one requiring a great deal of study and experience. Military and civilian leaders who have not mastered the development of military strategy, who have not intimate knowledge of the workings of government at the political-military interface, or the expertise to master the inner workings of government are at best caretakers. This is a particular problem for senior military leaders who, adhering to the culture or cultural predisposition to favor operational assignments over corporate ones, are historically ill-prepared for the job as an executive or corporate leader at the national level. The belief that a good operational commander will easily master the business of defense is, in my view, naive, and is perhaps the greatest weakness faced by military leaders. Military leaders who lack even the basic understanding of the workings of government, or worse, who attempt to impose their operational style on the bureaucracy, are ineffective and potentially dangerous. This situation argues that the military must take a more balanced approach to the development of its executive leadership cadre, and ensure that those who will reach the highest levels of the military structure arrive with the knowledge and the experience to master their jobs and be credible actors within government. No matter how good the military strategy, if the military leader themselves are not seen as credible, the government will not buy it. Even worse, inexperienced strategic leaders face the risk of being manipulated by a very experienced bureaucracy with potentially disastrous outcomes for the department. And if you want to know what I really think, ask me the question. Perhaps the most challenging factors facing the senior defense officials is the need for a realistic and achievable vision for the future of the Canadian Forces, or the military, that meets the nation's defense needs. This is, after all, the essence of the problem. How does the military achieve an acceptable capability that lives within the resource envelope that the nation can afford? This implicitly means establishing clear priorities and the acceptance of risk in a number of areas. Ultimately, the government leadership must decide on the risk that it will accept, but the military leadership has the responsibility to shape the evolving force structure and capabilities in a manner that will meet the needs without breaking the bank. This vision will be the essence of the government's defense strategy and must come first and foremost from the military leadership itself. We cannot forget that the responsibility of military leaders is to prepare the military for war and to advise the government on the strategic probabilities on the outcome of conflict. These are difficult tasks under any circumstances, but in times of austerity, they are particularly demanding and require a delicate balancing of the risks that are faced. But perhaps more fundamentally, they impose on the leadership, in particular the Chief of Defense Staff, a great moral dilemma. How far, and that dilemma is best espoused by the question, how far can the institution go in accepting risks in its capabilities to meet the nation's priorities before it places the Canadian forces and the nation in danger? Or as U.S. General Montgomery Meigs said in one of his writings, the general who speaks too loudly of preparing for war while the nation is at peace places at risk his position and status. However, the general who speaks too softly places at risk the security of his nation. So maintaining that balance and ensuring that while meeting the government's needs also addresses the defense needs from a professional military perspective is the key, and a very difficult balance it is. At the end of the day, it will be the military leader who has a clear and coherent vision of how to structure the military force within the resources available from the nation that will win the day. Failure to develop and articulate such a vision will result in 1,000 cuts, as each component of the military and the Defense Department will be scrutinized from a resource perspective. And I will tell you, having lived through this experience in the mid-90s, where we worked very hard to develop that strategy but never had that coherent long-term vision, we suffered the death of 1,000 cuts because you had no conceptual visionary underpinnings of what you were trying to achieve. And every argument had to be fought on a case-by-case basis, again, with bureaucrats and politicians who didn't understand the business. So it is a very important element to have that clarity of where you're trying to go. Perhaps the toughest part of achieving that vision is achieving unity amongst the military and defense leadership. This is difficult at the best of times, as service priorities and professional disagreements on approach often preclude attaining an achievable and shared vision. Given this, the government has historically faced great difficulties in obtaining a coherent view and recommendation from the military. And as Dr. Doug Bland has said in his book on Chiefs of Defense, even the introduction of a Chief of Defense Staff did not resolve the problem of inter-service rivalry, particularly where resource allocation was concerned. When adding to that mix the consideration of the civilian component on the defense team, the degree of difficulty increases. For while these ladies and gentlemen bring tremendous expertise to the fore, they lack the intimate knowledge on military capabilities that make it difficult for them to reach sound judgment on what is a risk to the nation. And trying to harmonize that view on the defense team is a challenge. In short, more than any other time, the age of austerity demands unity at the top of the Canadian Forces and the department. A lack of unity amongst the senior leaders on how the military should address the problem erodes the credibility of the defense team and leads to a loss of confidence by government, with a consequential decline in support. After all, we should not expect government ministers to support defense expenditures over other demands if the military cannot even agree on the requirements amongst themselves, and defense officials cannot develop coherent options and recommendations in how that strategy should be developed and implemented. Now, developing this shared vision amongst that leadership, particularly given the resource limitations, requires a high degree of objectivity and pragmatism. This is not an exercise that can be undertaken in an environment of wishful thinking. And I emphasize that because I've seen it done that way. You know, all we have to do is get through this problem and we'll have it licked. Previous budget reductions have tended to meet the challenge by just tightening the corporate belt, deferring capital expenditures till there's a change of fortunes and hoping for the best. While it may have worked in the past, I think the probability of a long-term economic downturn, that such a strategy is highly questionable and, in my view, would not work. Less money ultimately means less capability. And how the country balances the requirements and where it accepts the risks is the essence of the problem, and no amount of wishful thinking is going to allow us to escape that. Military leaders must seriously consider strategies, operational concepts, and technologies which take a fundamentally different approach to meeting the operational demands. Just expecting to replace old systems or capabilities with new and more expensive platforms, even though they may be more capable, is unlikely to achieve the required results. Indeed, it's likely to make your economic resource problem worse. And military leaders need to justify, in terms that civilian leaders and politicians can understand, why specific capabilities or systems are required, and the implications and risks if they are not forthcoming. Relying on your claimed professional judgment alone will not carry the day. And I've seen senior officers stand there and try and say, well, Minister, it's my judgment, and it doesn't count for much, if at all, anything. This force development requirement is not an easy issue to address, as the defense budget for a nation the size of Canada, with its continental and global responsibilities, is already, in my view, unreasonably small, and the statistics bear that out. But it falls to the defense leadership to develop options that will meet the short and medium-term economic priorities while maintaining a focus on the long-term strategic needs of the country. So you've got to deal with the short term, but don't forget the long-term requirement. This should mean, in part, the maintenance of a maritime, land, air, and special operating forces as befits the size of Canada and its importance. The idea that has surfaced in the past, and it was actively debated in the 90s, that Canada could or should consider doing away with one or more of its services, I personally believe is intellectually flawed. But there are still those out there who, given as things get worse, will come back to that issue. But that doesn't mean that some tough options should not be considered. In my view, at a time like this, in an age of austerity, everything has to be on the table. Asymmetry in force structure, a move to lighter forces, a greater reliance on reserves, the leveraging of new technology to replace traditional capabilities, even at risk. Those and many others, and I'm prepared to talk about some, more of them if you want, those kinds of options need to be seriously considered. The short and even mid-term risk inherent in such considerations are a concern, but they have to be balanced against the longer-term strategy. As I said earlier, less money means less capability. But we should consider a military force structure as elastic and ensure that as it is reduced, it maintains an inherent expandability that allows the nation to respond to future threats. We know that we're going to go down. The question is not that, it's how quickly we can bounce when the need is required. Here we are expecting the military leadership to prepare for the future, not the past. Now that's not an easy thing to do, and historically it's a major weakness amongst militaries. But that cultural resistance to change within the military particularly must be addressed, and the leadership must strive to shape the force for the future in the best way that they can. One of the speakers referred to Howard's statement of You know, you don't have to get it right, you just need to make sure you don't get it badly wrong. And I share that view in great strength. My focus to this point has been on the military force structure in terms of military capability, but one cannot ignore or forget that there's a tremendous corporate structure to the defense, the business of defense as well. And it was touched on in some of the questions and answers in the last session before lunch. I go back to the mid-90s and the work we did then. Facing that tremendous cut in budget, we created a team, MCCRT for the people who were serving at the time, and it stood for the Management, Command, and Control Re-engineering Team, and it literally took everything we did within the Department of National Defense and said, let's see if we can think about doing whole new ways of doing this, literally re-engineering everything we do. And the philosophy was predicated on a belief that if you can actually figure out all the things you do and whether all those steps are necessary, you streamline process, produce a much more efficient organization, and save yourself a lot of money. Now, I personally believe that the philosophy is sound, that approach can produce good results. But you also have to ensure that you have the support of government in doing that. And as was implied in the response to one of the questions this morning, government doesn't like to take that amount of risk. And while we did a lot of that and re-engineered a lot of things, we also undid them in subsequent years as some of those risks became real. But in addition to the risks, there are also great opportunities. And the objective of the military leadership should be to seize upon those opportunities and figure out how they can implement them to maintain the highest possible military capability within that smaller resource envelope. Now, beyond the force development aspects of the profession, as I've just articulated, the Defense Department must also be seen to be good stewards of the resources the nation provides. The perception that defense is squandering the dollars it receives or not getting real value for money erodes support more than any other thing that we do. The department and its leadership must be accountable and answer for the tax dollars it spends. This speaks in part to the department's ability to manage its money well, and such examples as curtailing spending in year only to turn back hundreds of millions of dollars at the end of the year, in my view, does not enhance confidence. But it also speaks to the attitude at the top of the organization, and perhaps I'm being a bit critical here, but the attitude that I perceive or has emerged over the last decade. As one who has lived through that very difficult budget reduction in the 90s, and as part of a defense team put together a great deal of effort into real resource stewardship, I can't help but perceive the last decade of defense budget growth has been accompanied by, to a degree, an erosion of resource stewardship and a growth in inefficiency. There was a view prevalent at the time that you either had effectiveness or you had efficiency, and that there were those who believed that we had taken efficiency to such a point we had no effectiveness. Well, the reality is it's a balance. And you need effectiveness, but you also need efficiency when you're considering the business of defense. As somebody said this morning, when you're going to operations, that's a different matter entirely. The imperatives are different. But if you don't have an efficient defense organization, you're never going to be effective. And in my view, if the Defense Department is to be credible, its resource stewardship and its accountability must be above reproach. My view is, certainly in Canada, the department has a ways to go. But while the defense officials, and in particular the military leadership, must have a sound and pragmatic strategy, they cannot achieve an effective and acceptable defense without engagement of government and the nation. I've spoken primarily to the manner of establishing and maintaining the credibility of defense in an age of austerity, but defense must also work synergistically with other elements of government to develop and market effective strategies. To my mind, the focus of that collaborative effort should be on government policy and relationship building, and I'd like to turn my attention to those two. The challenge for government in this period is to develop policies that support its agenda, and in this case, foremost amongst them, the need to manage the economy. Defense will be one of those policies, but many will argue that given our 200-year history of relative peace at home and the trend to fewer major conflicts abroad, we can afford to take risks. The defense team will need to make the case for an effective defense capability, not only to protect the country, but to contribute to the security of the global community. With all Western nations looking carefully at their defense budget and trimming back, we may collectively place at risk the security of the Western world, and we need to look at the whole global picture here, and the defense officials need to be able to make that argument. But faced with significant economic challenges, this is not an argument that is easily saleable on its own. In short, you can't argue for more money just because of the issue of defense. You need to look more broadly. And I believe that D&D needs to look broadly at means of supporting other government policies and strategies, leveraging them, if you will, to its own ends. That is to say, in the same way that military capital procurement seeks to support Canadian industry, all Canadian forces or defense activities investment should, to the extent possible, support other government priorities. Let me give you but one example. Working with Aboriginal and Northern Development Canada and local communities to advance individual and community development would be well received by most Canadians and also support defense objectives. The CF is facing a potential crisis in personnel supply, which is only going to get worse in the decade ahead. While the Aboriginal communities in Canada, which are facing high population growth and record levels of unemployment, could benefit from the personal training and development opportunities that the Canadian Forces could offer. Now, I acknowledge that to some degree, some of those programs targeting Aboriginal communities already exist, as do other programs to support other government departments and priorities. But I would suggest that those are just rudimentary examples of areas where whole programs could be put in place and opportunities could be explored to advance many of the government policies while also enhancing D&D. In the final analysis, while those programs are a cost to D&D and to defense, they enhance the value and credibility of the defense program and make it more palatable to the government and to the people of the country. This broader policy initiative should be the principal focus of defense relationship building. But more broadly, the department has to develop and maintain a relationship with government and the people of the country, which is essential to gaining support for its defense program. This naturally falls to the senior leadership to lead in this regard, but all members of the Canadian Forces and the department, I believe, need to play a role. As with any complex issue involving many agencies, the development of an effective defense strategy and program depends very much on the relationships developed amongst the key players within the respective government departments. Here, central agencies such as Privy Council Office and the Treasury Board top the list, but also Foreign Affairs and Public Works are critical to that relationship. But even smaller departments can have an influence on the defense program and should not be ignored. The purpose of such relationship building is to create an environment that permits the organizations to work together, and defense should strive to establish a degree of common understanding amongst those government departments that provide a base for addressing difficult issues. Much better if you already have a good relationship with your colleagues at Treasury Board, PCO, Foreign Affairs, Public Works, before you have to start facing up to the tough issues of how you balance an almost imponderable dynamic here. Now, such relationships need to be developed at a personal level, and we should expect that to occur at various levels, as I said earlier, in respective organizations. In some cases, we would expect most connections to be at the ADM or equivalent level, 3-star level, if you will. However, in many cases, the relationship development will need to occur at much, much lower levels. Now, it's not my intention to get into the detailed review of basic relationship building. This is not a social dynamic exercise, but I do think it's important to highlight some of the key elements of that relationship building process, because there's some important, I think, lessons that come out of that. First, as with my earlier comments, I see this as a long-term strategy, not a long-term plan, or not a short-term plan. One cannot expect to build trust and collaboration in the short term, especially when driven by specific issues. Walking into your colleague at Treasury Board when they know and you know that you're in dire straits in terms of money, it's not the right environment or time to be trying to build a relationship. One cannot expect to build trust and confidence in the short term. Rather, we need to build mutual understanding over years. To a large degree, the civilian members of the defense team achieved this through their public service career in Ottawa. And you need to be able to leverage those civilian colleagues greatly in that regard. Military leaders, on the other hand, come and go, and this creates an inherent difficulty best addressed by developing a career path for strategic military leaders that ensures repeated service in the national capital. As I implied earlier, when you have a culture that says operations is what it's all about, you actually don't develop that type of expertise. But this approach that I'm suggesting permits them to develop both the understanding and the relationship comparable to the public service. I think there's also great merit to the idea of seconding military officers to other government departments to achieve the same end. It has been tried with variable success in the past, but it has never, in my view, realized its full potential. In developing relationships, I believe it falls to DND, and in particular the military leadership, to take the initiative. As anyone who's worked inside Ottawa and that system knows, there's a great rivalry amongst departments, and DND, the largest federal department by far, is always seen as the elephant in the room. It is not too strong a view to say that the department in many ways is feared by the bureaucracy. Given that, don't expect others to come looking to get to know you. Defense has to lead if you're going to build a relationship. And having developed that relationship, it also falls to defense to maintain it. So really, relationship building and maintenance of the relationship is an ongoing daily affair. In building the relationship, care must be taken to be respectful and value the other's point of view. And I have to say this is particularly a problem with military officers, who have a tendency, as aggressive type A problem solvers, to denigrate other corporate cultures and other organization cultures, and take the approach, we have all the solutions, just get out of the way and we'll solve the problem for you. Only by reaching a point where both parties can truly value each other for what they bring to the table and truly respect the other organization can you expect a relationship to flourish. And if you can't get over that, those guys in uniform, you'll never achieve a relationship in that environment. The relationship needs to be established where there's mutual interest and where both parties perceive value from it. Here, my earlier comments on supporting government policies are relevant. By offering to support government policies and departmental programs where there is a suitable nexus, and I emphasize that, where there's a suitable nexus, defense establishes a cooperative framework upon which both parties can build. But key to this philosophy, and hard to swallow, is that DND needs to take an approach where it is seen as giving more than it is receiving. Other parties have to see a benefit in it if they're going to engage in it. Finally, the relationship has to be personal. And this is not superficial, it has to be real. These are people you have to get to know as professional colleagues, and hopefully in many cases develop into personal friendships. Only with that level of chemistry can real tough issues be broached effectively and dealt with over the long term. And talk to anybody, and there are a number in this room that have been there, who have developed those, and they have been effective. And we can point to many who could never get to that point, and they were almost uniformly ineffective. Now, there are many other aspects to the challenge, but by developing a sound working and personal relationship with a key government player, DND establishes a network of people who have a better understanding of the department and the military, and have a personal connection that enables more effective collaboration. Such an initiative, in my view, needs to be part of D&D's routine engagement within government. Of course, as I said earlier, there are many other areas where relationships need to be developed, albeit at different levels. Military and defense officials should get to know political leaders, to include MPs and senators, from all parties, and where possible, even get to know cabinet ministers, although, depending on the government, that is sometimes problematic. This permits a more routine dialogue on defense matters and, again, creates a baseline of understanding upon which both parties can build when you have to engage in difficult discussions. And we should also bear in mind that D&D should be connected to Canadians across the country. Everything from local communities to veterans groups to defense interest groups are important to get to know and have them know you. These connections should allow D&D to better communicate the defense story. If Canadians are to support defense expenditures, they need to know what they're getting for their defense dollar. A program such as, pick a title, "What is Defense Doing for You?" would go a long way to educate the public and indeed government on how the nation benefits from defense expenditures. Those kinds of initiatives are important in communicating what D&D is and how important it is to the country. Now, I've covered some ground and there's much, much more to talk about, but I'm going to bring my comments to an end and we'll get into some questions. I tried to provide you a perspective on the profession of arms in an age of austerity, and in particular, how to address how military leaders should deal with civilian authorities in times of retrenchment. It is my view that a credible defense team of professional strategic leaders can create the condition that will optimize scarce resources and shape a defense strategy to meet the nation's needs. This, however, requires the development of a shared vision for defense based on a pragmatic assessment of the options and the willingness to accept risks. It also demands the nurturing of relationships across government and the nation, and the shaping of the defense program to optimize its support for broad government policy. However, before closing, I have to present a view, or I have to state that I presented a view that has been predicated on operating within a rational environment, or at least a reasonably rational environment. The view that we are trying to work together for the purposes of the nation, notwithstanding our focus is defense, and others are doing likewise. In a period of austerity, I think we have to acknowledge that may not always be the case. As one author put it, periods of scarcity can tend to turn modest policy differences into zero-sum showdowns. I've seen it before, and we'd be naive to think that it wouldn't happen again. In short, as much as the Defense Department may wish to take a rational approach to the challenge of collaborating with others, that may not be a realistic option. At a minimum, defense leaders must be prepared to see the environment as they seek collaboration shift rapidly to one of open competition, and be prepared to manage it accordingly. That, of course, is another subject, and I won't go into there. In either scenario, defense leaders, in particular senior military leaders serving in a time of austerity, face some of the greatest professional and ethical challenges of their careers. How they face that task will determine the future of the nation's military and greatly influence its defense and security. As I look at the situation facing the Canadian Forces leadership today, as I project into the future, it is my view they really have their work cut out for them, and they have my total support. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. I look forward to your questions.